Before we begin, first and foremost, our congratulations goes out to the awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala faraj al-Sharif. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. As we celebrate the birth of his great uncle, our second Imam, Hassan al-Mujtaba, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sincerely to grant us the opportunity to perform his ziyarah fi dunya wal akhirah and to obtain his shafa'a fi dunya wal akhirah. I would also like to take this opportunity to extend Ramadan Kareem to everyone and to thank the community for inviting us back. We look forward to spending these next 2 weeks with you, learning again with you, and inshallah all of us will walk away from these blessed nights with an increase in spirituality. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعن الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وابتغوا إليه الوسيلة وجاهدوا في سبيله لعلكم تفلحون صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi, my respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The verse that we have quoted comes to us from chapter number 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 35 of the Holy Quran. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides us with an intriguing verse which speaks to us about how to successfully obtain a wasila. How that you and I, when we seek a proximity to God, nearness to God, and we take something that will project our dua, project our supplication to a realm where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more likely to accept it, more likely to accept it quicker, and most likely to action it immediately, this is the taking of a wasila. For example, there are many ways that you and I may take any of the great things endorsed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a wasila. We may take Ahlul Bayt, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een. We may take the Holy Quran. We may take a particular maqam or station that we visit on ziyarah. And so when we go to these particular places or these particular things, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by these particular things, it is in the hope that our dua will be accepted quicker and will be implemented quicker by virtue of these things that we seek proximity through. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in this verse, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, ittaqullah, have taqwa, be aware, have God consciousness. Ittaqullah wabtaghu ilayhi al-wasila, seek a means of proximity to God, seek a wasila, وَجَاهِدُوا فِي سَبِيلِهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ, and strive hard in His way until or so that you may achieve your success. And so this verse has a very distinct connotation when it comes to our second Imam, Hassan al-Mujtaba, salawatullah salamuhu alayhi, whose birth anniversary we celebrate tonight. And that is particularly because, according to our narrations, our second Imam is given the title as being Kareem al-Muhammad, meaning that he is the generous from amongst al-Muhammad. Now every one of Ahlul Bayt, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een, are generous. And if you were to knock at the door of any of those great members of A'imma, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een, none would reject us. However, certain members of Ahlul Bayt have been provided with a certain title. For example, our seventh Imam and Abu Fadl, salamullahi alayhima, are known as Bab al-Hawa'ij. Our second Imam is known as Kareem al-Muhammad. This concept of generosity is the highest level of generosity within Islam. You see, there are different types of words in the Arabic language for generosity, and some of them denote slightly different parts of generosity. As an example, the word al-Wahhab is often related towards spiritual generosity. For example, in the verse of Quran where it would say, Habli min ladunka dhurriyatan tayyiba. Or for example, when we say that, do not misguide me after you have guided me. And these words from Al-Wahhab come from the concept of being spiritually generous. It's not a material generosity. If you want to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for more rizq, or if you want to ask Him for better health, these things do not come from Al-Wahhab. Spiritual growth comes from Al-Wahhab. However, when you come to seeing the titles Al-Jawad and Al-Kareem, both of these are specifically relative towards generosity. Al-Jawad is the individual that he gives, and he gives a lot. So for example, if you were to knock at someone's door and seek need from them, and they give you a lot, they give you more than you were expecting, that person is known as Al-Jawad. He is generous. Kareem, however, is the one who is so generous that when he gives to you, there is never a need for you to return back and ask him a second time. And so the fact that our second Imam is known as Kareem al-Muhammad, it means that when you take this grand individual as a wasila for those things that you need, you have certainty that when he gives on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will get so much that you will not need to ask the second Imam alayhi salam again. And this is this concept that we want to talk about tonight of wasila. What are the various discussions that wasila take? Well, normally you and I, being in a community that engages in much dialogue with our Sunni brothers and sisters, the concept of wasila and shafa'ah is normally one that we discuss. However, I would like to assume that tonight we know that we can take a wasila, we know that taking an intercessor is permissible, and so we do not want to take the concept of wasila from this particular angle. We want to look at it from three different angles. Number one, when we take a wasila, we take this particular wasila in light of taking someone who is going to assist me. And so it's not just about the permissibility of assisting. Why is it so important to take a wasila? Number one. Number two, we also want to ask ourselves about the various stages of what wasila mean, and the various spiritual stations that one who takes a wasila can arrive at. And so when he ascends the spiritual chain of seeking through Ahlul Bayt, what is the highest level of wasila an individual can achieve? And so through these sorts of discussions, we will be able to understand taking the wasila of our second Imam, Hasan al-Mujtaba, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi, better, inshaAllah. And so, why is it important that you and I take a wasila? For what reason, what benefit, to what goal? We find that there are many times in the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a verse where He says that there will be people who shall not be helped. And those individuals, it is because they have taken a wrong wasila. For example, if you look at the last couple of verses of Surah An-Nuh, chapter number 71 of the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes in this chapter the story of Nuh alayhi salam up until the flood point. Going after, in other chapters, he speaks about the flood itself. But in this verse, it's about his interaction with his community, how his community respond, how his community treat him. And so, you find the verses, he says, for example, my Lord, I used to call them in the night, and I used to call them in the day, and I used to call them in public, and I used to call them in private. You know how they would respond? They would come and they would put their fingers, the Quran says, they would put their fingers in their ears. They would even put their hands in their mouth to stop them from responding to Nuh alayhi salam, and they would take their cloaks and their clothes and place it above their bodies so they couldn't even see Nuh, and Nuh alayhi salam could not see them. Because if Nuh alayhi salam is walking the street and he sees someone from his community and he recognizes this is such and such a person, then he would want to engage in dialogue with them. And so they would put their covers over their faces in order to block themselves out. The verses continue, and the chiefs of the tribes, they would say to their people, don't listen to Nuh alayhi salam. Remain strong upon your idols. Call upon your idols. Seek your intercession. Seek your wasila through the idols. Do not listen to anything that Nuh alayhi salam is saying. And as such, when the verse says that they were drowned and that they were flung to the pitfalls of hell, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that they did not find therein any helpers for themselves. Why is this so important? God says that they found themselves no helpers in the hellfire. In the Arabic language and in logic, there is a certain study of language. There's a way in which we look at words and see the implication of what words means. For example, in logic, it's called dalil al-iltidamiyya. And in this concept, it means that when you see a word, based upon that word, there is an implication outside of those particular words. Let me give you a simple example. If I said to you, you know what, I'm really thirsty. What's the implication of that statement? The implication of that statement is, would you mind getting me a glass of water? I'm not just saying I'm thirsty because I want to inform you that I'm thirsty. The implication is that I'm hoping that you would get me a glass of water, right? So in language, we see that there are words which imply something outside of that particular statement. In the same way, this particular verse, when God says to these idol worshippers, they were flung to the pitfalls of hell. They entered into akhirah. And so they did not find themselves any helpers for them. The implication of this means is that helpers are allowed for you and I. The fact is, those individuals didn't find themselves helpers. However, it may be that in the akhirah, in the hereafter, the fact that they didn't find themselves helpers, that doesn't mean you and I can't find for ourselves helpers. And so the concept of taking wasila or taking shifa'ah is specifically in this way. It is so that you and I present ourselves and present our need to an individual that is more likely to have his dua accepted than my dua accepted, because of his proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or by virtue of the location being sanctified in the eyes of God, that by virtue of asking in that location, there is no chance that God would reject that particular place. There's a narration, for example, it says that one day, our 10th Imam, Ali al-Hadi, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi, was very ill. And as he was very ill, he called upon two of his servants and asked them and said, please, I'm too ill to be able to get up. Take this money, your provisions, and go towards Karbala. Go towards Karbala, and I want you to stand underneath the dome of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for my intercession, for the betterment of myself, my cure. The two servants were confused. They said, Ya ibn Rasulullah, you are the 10th Imam. You are Imam Ali al-Hadi. You are the same as Hussein ibn Ali, are you not? As in the eyes of God, you are both Hujjah upon earth. You are both divinely appointed Imams. Why do you, the Imam, seek to have your intercession and wasila take place in the shrine of Hussein ibn Ali alayhi salam, your grandfather? He said, indeed, we are the same. We are on the same capacity. We are on the same level in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, there are certain places Allah loves to be supplicated. And if He supplicated in those places, He would not reject that supplication. And so I wish that you would go on my behalf, seek it underneath the dome of my grandfather, and inshallah I would become better by virtue of that dua underneath the dome of my grandfather, Abu Abdullah al-Hussein salawatullahu salamuhu alayhi. And so we have these consistent dua. For example, Allahumma rizqna fid dunya ziyarat al-Hussein wa fil akhirati shafa'at al-Hussein wahshurna yawm al-qiyamati ma'al Hussein. Oh Allah, give me the opportunity to perform the ziyarah of Hussein ibn Ali in this world. Allow me to have his intercession in the afterlife, and on the day of judgment to be raised alongside with him, because we hope that he is my helper. And so from the Quranic perspective, there are people who take the wrong helpers, and there are people who take the right helpers. If you take the right helpers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would assist you, and those people would assist you no matter the circumstance you would find yourself in. In this way, there is a very interesting debate amongst the Shia ulama that says, what is the best way of doing wasila? What is the afdal way of doing wasila? And our dua, our ad'iyah, our supplications show that there are two ways of making wasila. One of them is acceptable and mustahab, and one of them is afdal, meaning it is the utmost best way of taking a wasila. What are the two ways? The first way is the one that we are most acquainted to, and that is, for example, the method that is taken in dua, tawassul. For example, we say, Inna tawajjahna wastashfa'na wa tawassalna bika ila Allah wa qaddamnaka bayna yaday hajatina. We say to the Imam in particular, or the individual we are seeking, you take my need to God. Stand between me and God, and I ask you, O Hassan ibn Ali alayhi salam, that you give me on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the first way, and this is absolutely permissible, because as we know, the Holy Quran tells us that those individuals who are given an esteemed rank in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because they lived and died in a certain way, you should not consider them as dead. They are alive. I can communicate with those individuals. Quran says, وَلَا تَقُولُوا لِمَنْ يُقْتَلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتٍ بَلْ أَحْيَاء وَلَكِنْ لَا تَشْعُرُونَ. If I ask Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, then I know he is alive and he can hear me and respond back to me. This is the first way, when I directly approach Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam. The second way is afdal, meaning that this is the way which Ahlul Bayt en masse practiced their wasila. You see, it is very important for us to distinguish and say that however Ahlul Bayt practiced something, that is the best way of practicing that action of wasila. And so if I want to do it, I should do the way in which they did the very same action. Our ad'iyah, our supplications, we have certain supplications that are considered to be most prominent and most correct. For example, Sahifa Sajjadiyya is considered to be most correct, utmost correct. What is in there, we can take as being certainly from our fourth Imam. For example, Dua Kumail. We consider, although there are slightly different wordings in certain area, that the Dua of Kumail comes to us from Amir al-Mu'mineen. And so what we find within these supplications is the way in which Ahlul Bayt supplicated towards their Lord. For example, you find in Dua Kumail, we recite this every week, we know these verses so well. Our first Imam says, وَأَتَوَسَّلُ إِلَيْكَ بِرَبُوبِيَّتِكَ. You see here, this methodology of wasila, as taken by Amir al-Mu'mineen, is distinguished, different from Dua Tawassul. He says, وَأَتَوَسَّلُ إِلَيْكَ بِرُبُوبِيَّتِكَ. And I make wasila directly to you, my Lord, بِرُبُوبِيَّتِكَ, by virtue of your lordship. Can you see the difference? The first way in Dua Tawassul is to seek the wasila and say, O Imam al-Hasan, you take my dua, you stand between me and God. This is the first way of doing tawassul. The second way of doing tawassul is directly to God, but asking bihaqqi Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. It's very different. In fact, if you look at the ahadith and you look at the du'as that we have, all of those that are correct, you will always find Ahlul Bayt take the second version of wasila. They will always say, for example, in any of Sahih Sajjadiyah, the fourth Imam will say, my Lord, increase me in rizq, increase me in health, grant me protection on my journey, bihaqqi Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. The difference between the two is the object of who I'm speaking to. The first one is asking the Imam to go and present my dua to God. The second one is my dua is presented directly to God, asking Him to accept through Ahlul Bayt's name, which He would not reject. The second one is the one that is most practiced by Ahlul Bayt. However, in regards to the first, in regards to asking Ahlul Bayt, that should not be stopped. That should be practiced. I should stand in ziyarah and address Ahlul Bayt. When it is their nights in which we specifically commemorate and celebrate for them, we should specifically be asking them. When we go and stand in front of their dhari and they have invited us to their house, we should specifically be asking them, because that is the etiquette between two individuals. If you invite me to your house, I come and I need something, do I go and ask someone else? You're the host. It would be rude to go and ask someone else. And so the fact that you have invited me to your house, if I need something, I directly ask to you. And so these are the two ways of doing our wasila. And indeed, it is down to us to be able to decide which methodology of wasila we want to take. However, according to the methodology of Ahlul Bayt, you will always find that they ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bihaqqi one another, bihaqqi Ahlul Bayt. Salawatullahu salamuhu alayhim ajma'een. And so, wasila has spirituality. It is based upon three levels. Allama Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Tabatabai, rahmatullahi alayhi, in his Tafsir al-Mizan, says that there are stages of wasila. The first stage is simply by the tongue. It's when I sit in Da'a Iftitah, it's when I sit in Da'a Tawassul, Ziyarat Ashura, and although I am physically present, spiritually I'm not present. My mind is on something else. It may be what's coming for iftar, it may be what job needs to be done tomorrow, it may be what I'm going to have for Sahri, it may be that I'm checking Facebook. If these things occur, and I'm seeing some people smiling, which means it occurs far too often, especially from the kids now. So especially when you see that if my concentration is not there, this is the first stage of wasila. It is from the tongue. Here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so generous that indeed, although it is from the tongue, He is still likely to accept it. However, that doesn't mean that I have spiritually grown through my dua, through my supplication, through my communication with God and Ahlul Bayt. So the next two levels are the higher levels of spirituality. And in our supplications, and when we address Ahlul Bayt, we should be aiming to address them with these two levels of spirituality. The second one is what? It is entitled pain of love. Pain of love means that when I love somebody or something so much that because of my separation from that place or that individual, I feel a longing, a yearning within myself, and there is a pain, and the only way I can overcome that pain is through communication with that particular individual. For example, a mother who has not spoken to her child for some time, and a father, of course. But a mother whose love is so much for the child, if that person hasn't spoken to their mother for a while, there is a pain of love, isn't there? There's that longing, that desire to communicate with the child. For example, when you and I have not had the tawfiq to visit Mecca or Karbala or Najaf or Mashhad for a while, there is that longing within ourselves to be able to go and stand in front of these grand individuals, to be able to feel the atmosphere, the spiritual power, to replenish ourselves. That pain of separation, that is that longing within the heart. You see here, this longing, there's a story that we have mentioned before, but it so eloquently and beautifully describes what pain of love truly feels like. It is that individual who longs so much that his whole day and his time and his life is subjected towards that pain, and only through the fulfillment of that thing does the pain subside. There's a narration which comes to us from Shaheed al-Mutahhari, rahmatullahi alayh. He says about a story one day about an abd, a servant, and this individual became more and more religious. And by virtue of him becoming more and more religious, he wanted to do more and more for God. He wanted to spend more time. He wanted to think more. He wanted to serve more. And so, each night, he would wake up in the middle of the night and spend some time on the musalla. Some time. He would do dhikr, and he would recite Quran, and he would recite dua, and his salat al-layl. And every night, he would slightly increase the amount of time that he spent on the musalla. So for example, the first night, he spent 10 minutes, then 12 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And a number of days had passed, and he had been longing for this worship and this proximity to God. And after a number of days of having increased his worship, Iblis came to him. Iblis came to him and said to him, Ya Abdullah, O servant of God, I'm confused. If you had knocked on the door of anyone else this long, every night, by now you would have heard a response, wouldn't you? He says, what do you mean? Well, every night you've longed and longed for God more and more. And every night you've knocked on his door through dhikr and supplications and Quran and such. Have you heard him respond back to you? Has he said anything back to you? The man said, no, I haven't heard anything. Each night I've increased my worship by a few more minutes. My desire was there more and more. I haven't heard anything. He says, see, if you knocked at the door of anyone else, they would have opened up the door a long time ago. You would have heard a response from them by now. And so, Shaheed Mutahhari narrates that this man closed up his musalla, finished his ibadah early that night, and went to sleep. And that night, in his dream, the man heard a voice. The voice said, O my servant, O my servant, why did you close your musalla up early? He gave the same answer Iblis had trained him to think with. He said, well, I'd been knocking on your door every night, and I had not heard back from you. Each night I'd longed for you more and more and desired more and more, and I hadn't heard back. The voice responds and says, "O my servant, you have not understood the worship between me and you. You've not understood the way our relationship works. The fact that you had longed for me more, that is my response to you in the first place. That's how you and I communicate. The fact that you desire more from me, desire proximity to me, that means you and I are in communion. That means you and I are in proximity together." And so the second way wasila takes place is through that longing of an individual. And so when you ask through an imam, there should be that, not just concentration, but that love and that pain and that desire of that individual to hear you. And the more you find that you are supplicating through that wasila, the more you find proximity and desire of that wasila, the closer you have become to the imam that you are seeking through. And so, when you constantly ask Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, "Allow me the opportunity to perform ziyarah of yours within Medina," it means that you and him have a relationship. It means that he loves you and you love him. It means that there is that bond between you that cannot be broken. There is that pain of love between the two of you. The third and the final is not when there is just a pain of desire, is when there is unity between you and the individual whom you long for. Where instead of you just asking through him, he comes to you in order to deliver that which you have asked for. There is a story that says one day, there was a person who loved the second Imam so much. He loved Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam so much, and he decided to give a gift to him. What was the gift? He decided to recite the entirety of the Quran and gift this to Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam. And so weeks and months passed, and this individual recited, and he finished the Quran, and he raised his hands in his niyyah, and he said, "God, bear witness, whatever thawab is attached to this amal, gift it to Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, because I love him, and I want him to be pleased with me, and I want proximity to him." So that gentleman went to sleep. And in that night, he also received a dream. He saw the second Imam in front of him. The second Imam was sitting on a grand throne, the likes of which could not be described by the human tongue. This throne was filled with the most pristine and beautiful and valuable of jewels all across it. And the Imam, when he was sitting, this throne was sitting on the shore of a beach, a beautiful pristine beach. And the waves were gently coming in and coming out, lapping in and around the throne that the second Imam was sitting on. The Imam addressed the individual in his dream, "Salamu alaykum, alaykum salam. I am Hasan al-Mujtaba. You had gifted me this recitation of the Holy Quran." The Imam smiled and thanked the individual for the blessings, for the thawab that had been given. And then the Imam had a cup of water in his hand. And he said, "I just want to teach you one thing, just to understand who I am. This glass of water which I have in my hand is the thawab, is the relative amount of thawab that I have received from reciting this Holy Quran, the one that you gifted to me. This Quran, it is relative to the size of this glass of water in my hand." The Imam tips it into the ocean that is lapping around his throne. And he says, "Do you see this behind me, this ocean? This is the thawab that I have got. This is the thawab that I have got by virtue of my amal towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in my lifetime." Think about this very carefully. Because we said that Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam is Kareem al-Muhammad. He is the generous one. He is the one that when he gives so much that nothing is taken away from him. That he gives so much, you and I would not be in need of asking him again. If I recite one Quran and give it to him, it's the equivalent of a glass of water. If I was to ask Kareem al-Muhammad to bless me and my family and my community fi dunya wal akhirah, he has an ocean behind him to give to you and I, if only we were to ask Kareem al-Muhammad salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi. And so we conclude with that very famous narration about how generous the second Imam is and what he really is, and that ocean that sits behind him. That famous narration that says, shortly after the martyrdom of Amir al-Mu'mineen, the Imam is in Medina. One of the Khawarij comes and enters into Medina and finds Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam and says to him, curse be upon your father. Na'udhu billah, curse be upon your father. The second Imam responds by saying, it appears you don't know who we are. If you need anything from us, we would be the ones to give it to you. If you need a horse to ride to your next location, we would give it to you. If you need new clothes, we would give it to you. If you are in need of a house to stay tonight, we would give it to you. If you had lost any of your belongings en route in your journey, we would replace them for you. This is who we are, and this is how much we are willing to even give to you, our enemies. The man from the Khawarij looks at Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam and says, I had been cursing your father all of these years. Now I realize who Ahl al-Bayt really are. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammadan Rasulullah wa anna Aliyan Hujjatullah. And indeed he knows where to place his Risala, and indeed you are the Imam of our time. And so, brothers and sisters, on a night like this, when we celebrate the second Imam's birth, we are in need. And more so, there are people around the world who are in need, especially those people in Iraq, especially those people in Syria, Palestine, and many people around the world. Tonight, on this blessed night, let us remember them first and foremost, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, bihaqqi Kareem al-Muhammad, that their situation is improved. Those who are in a state of war and poverty and natural disaster, lack of education and disease, that their situation is changed for the better. Bihaqqi Kareem al-Muhammad. Wassalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May I ask you to recite a loud salawat on behalf of our second Imam, Imam Hassan al-Mujtaba, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi.
لهفت إلى جودك والرضا بقضائك عوضا من منع الباخل ومندوعة عما في عيد المستأثر وأن الرائل إليك قريب المسافر وأنك لا تعتجب عن خلقك إلا أن تحجبهم الآمال دونك وقد قصدت إليك بطلبتي وتوجهت إليك بحاجتي وجعلت بك وبدعائك توسلي ومن غير استحقاق لاستماعك مني ولا استجاب لعفوك عني بل ثقتي بكرمك وسكوني إلى صدقك ولجيل الإيمان بتوحيدك ويقيني بمعرفتك مني أن لا رب لي غيرك ولا إله إلا أنت وحدك لا شريك لك اللهم أنت القائل وقولك حق ووعدك صدق واسأل الله من فضله إن الله كان بكم رحيما وليس من صفاتك يا سيدي أن تأمر بالصواب وتمنع العصيان وأنت المنان بالعطيات على عدل وملكتك والعائد عليهم تأذن رأفتك إلهي ربيتني في نعمك وإحسانك صغيرا ونبهت باسمي كبيرا فيا من رباني في الدنيا بإحسانه وتفضله ونعمه وأشارني في الآخرة إلى عفوه وكرمه